All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started on our focus group session. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to kick off this three-part series of our virtual focus group sessions with the intent of building a sustainable beef research roadmap. I'm Samantha Worth. I'm the Executive Director for the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and I will be moderating this discussion today. Go ahead and advance, Lauren. So just a little overview of what we have in store today. I'm going to provide a little bit of background on USRSB for those of you who aren't familiar with us. And then we'll have Jasmine Bruno pop on and provide an overview of FFAR. We'll introduce our subject matter experts really leading this effort for our land resources session. And then we'll go through a guided discussion. Next slide, please. So just general housekeeping. The first part of this will all be dialogue. Everyone will be muted, but please use the Q&A down below in your Zoom box to ask any questions as we're going through everything. As soon as we get through all of the presentations, we will open it up for an active Q&A where we'll address questions that we see in the chat, but we'll also be able to unmute folks if you'd like to join in the conversation rather than just in the chat. And then this will be recorded and we will be sharing it after the webinar so that you can come back to this or share it with friends that you think this would be interesting for them. And we'll also have a follow-up survey that helps us to gather a bit more information as we prepare for our in-person event later this year. Next slide, please. So a little background on the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. We are a multi-stakeholder organization. We span from cow-calf producers all the way through retail food service, and we also have members in civil society and allied industry groups. Our mission is to advance, support, and communicate continuous improvement of sustainability across the U.S. beef value chain. And our vision is to be that the U.S. beef value chain is the trusted global leader in environmentally sound, socially responsible, and economically viable beef. And the way that we as the Roundtable have kind of honed in on sustainability is through 6 high priority indicators of sustainability, which you'll see down here on the screen are air and greenhouse gas emissions, land resources, water resources, employee safety and well-being, animal health and well-being, and efficiency and yield. Next slide, please. So what USRSB is very strong in is bringing the entire industry together to really help define what is beef sustainability and what are some of the key ways that we can help advance sustainability in the beef industry as a whole. So since our formation in 2015, we've had several kind of key milestones each year to help us in our mission. And in 2022, we launched our industry-wide sustainability goals that go across those 6 indicators of sustainability we just showed on that previous slide. And our work since then has really been geared towards what are the critical activities that are needed in order for us to be effectively making progress towards those goals. And that's what brings us all here today. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, in 2022, we launched our sustainability goals. And what you'll see on the screen here is just kind of an abbreviated version of our overarching goals. The Roundtable has set some pretty ambitious goals, and it has been now our mission to really figure out, as I mentioned, how to make action towards these goals. So next slide. Part of that has been foundational in our most recent strategic plan. So as you'll see here, we have 4 key core strategies. The first one being to measure and report progress towards our goals and sector targets, and to drive adoption of sustainability practices, and then identify, facilitate, and support sustainability research priorities, and of course, ensure organizational success. So core to our strategic plan are a few key elements, which are on the next slide, please, Lauren. So the reason that we're all kind of gathering here today is based in this strategic plan. So really wanting to establish subject matter experts to help us define baselines for all of our sustainability goals and viable streams of measurement and action forward. We want to build relationships with priority partners to help us to act upon our goals, and really bring in the full value chain as we tend to do, in order to really create some meaningful action towards our sustainability goals. So all of that we would like to have culminate in the publication of a gap analysis on current state of the science related to our goals, as well as a research agenda. So that's where we have come today to partner up with FFAR. So I will pass it over to Jasmine to give a little background on FFAR.
Hello all, welcome. So my name is Jasmine Bruno, and I am a scientific program director at FFAR, or the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. FFAR was established in the 2014 Farm Bill, with our mission being building collaborative partnerships to support audacious science addressing today's food and agriculture challenges, really with this vision towards providing every person access to affordable, nutritious food grown on thriving farms. And at FFAR, in the research that we support, we really look to complement USDA's research agenda by filling those critical knowledge gaps that we're identifying. And then it's a significant part of FFAR is that for every federal dollar that we spend, we look to bring in a non-federal dollar to increase spending in public ag research. And then really looking towards focusing on actionable science. So science that involves farmers to address challenges and really moving research from the lab and into the field. So since our first grant went out the door in 2016, we at FFAR have made over 360 grants with over 550 unique partners, because again, collaboration is really at the heart of what we do here at FFAR. And then 750 million have been invested in ag research. And for every federal dollar that we have invested, we have brought in at least $1.40 of non-federal funding into ag research. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So as we approached FFAR's 10-year anniversary, we conducted a strategy review process where we engaged and where we aim to go in the future of FFAR. Through that process, FFAR really honed in on these 4 priority areas. So thriving production systems, and this is supporting crop and animal systems, and this is where I sit in the FFAR portfolio. And then healthy food systems, supporting urban food systems and working at the health ag nexus. And then the agro-ecosystems team, which is really where we focus on soil health, sustainable water management, and our broader climate portfolio. And then sustainable workforce development, really investing in ensuring that we have the agriculture workforce that we need. So on this call today, from the FFAR side, we're bringing together members from both the production systems team and the agro-ecosystems team with this effort with USRSB. We really are acknowledging that beef systems are complex, adaptive systems, and as such, we need research efforts and want to support research efforts that align with this complexity and really embrace this complexity. So we're excited to be here and join this effort with USRSB. And with that, I'll pass it back to my colleague, Sam.
Thanks, Jasmine. So yeah, with our USRSB goals and FFAR's mission and vision and research priorities in mind, we've partnered, as Jasmine said, to really foster the development of this sustainable beef research roadmap. We have a workshop that will be happening in person later this year to really dive into what we uncover from the first 3 focus group sessions we're holding, starting with this land one. So the goal of these focus group sessions are to encourage everyone to participate actively and kind of work to collaboratively identify some of the key areas of research, research avenues that are needed to help us support achieving our ambitious goals. So next slide, please. a little bit of background. I'm sure since you all made it onto this call today, you've seen our registration links for the other 2 sessions, but would just like to um, remind you all that those sessions are happening. There'll be a QR code to get to the registration page for those at the end of our discussion today. But following this initial kickoff focus group session, we will move into a session focused on our water resources goals and then our air and greenhouse gas emission goals. Next slide, please. So the purpose of these focus groups, primarily our goal is, as I've said, to identify research and knowledge gaps across our indicator areas, this week specifically on the land resource front. This information is going to help us to be able to publish that gap analysis and research roadmap to help us kind of guide future activities around beef sustainability efforts. Our focus group intent is to convene subject matter experts and stakeholders from across the beef value chain to have a robust discussion in advance of that in-person workshop. And our strategy is to leverage each of these interactive sessions to investigate the current state of the science, understand what knowledge and data gaps there are, challenges and opportunities. So really just want a robust discussion. Welcome everyone to participate in sharing their thoughts and feedback as we start to think through what does it look like to address our land goals specifically for this week's session. Next slide, please. So just to kind of level set everyone, what is our land goal? So our overarching goal for the land sustainability indicators that the U.S. beef value chain will work to maintain and improve grazing lands under the care of U.S. beef producers. We'll achieve this by establishing a baseline of acres under grazing management plans by 2023. This is something that we have worked with our partners at Trust in Beef, Trust in Food to understand through a national survey. And today we estimate that only 11% or so of our goal of 385 million acres of covered under written grazing management plan are actually under written grazing management plans. So that's about 42 million acres currently under written grazing management plans. So we have a lot of ground to cover here for that second bullet point of achieving 385 million acres under a written grazing management plan by 2050. And then our final way of achieving this overarching goal is supporting programs that respect property rights, create value, and expand producer capacity to deploy well-managed grazing strategies to ensure lasting legacies founded on conservation and economic success. So really thinking about not only how do we increase uptake of grazing management plans, but how do we do it in a way that is actually useful for producers and provides value back to them and their operations so that they can maintain these grazing lands for years to come. So the focus of this discussion today will be truly on the cow-calf stalker side of things, thinking about how we're managing lands. We have written grazing management plans set up as kind of that first step to help us achieve our overarching land goal, but there's a lot that grazing management and grazing cattle play into all of our goals. So we'll have a pretty deep discussion today beyond just thinking about acres of land covered, but really truly thinking about how cattle and land interact with one another to preserve our lands. So without further ado, we'll move next slide and present our subject matter experts today. So we have 3 fantastic subject matter experts helping us to really build out our research roadmap as it relates to the land goal. And I'm going to give brief introductions and then I'll pass it off to Dr. Goodwin to kick off our official presentation. So our first expert, Dr. Jeff Goodwin, currently serves as the director of the Texas A&M Center for Grazing Lands and Ranch Management. The center focuses on providing applied ranch relevant research and education, prioritizing the ecological and economic resilience of grazing land resources and ranching operations. Dr. Goodwin has over 24 years of experience working directly with ranchers and grazing land managers, implementing stewardship-focused management, and providing innovative solutions to grazing land issues. Our next expert, Dr. Jason Roundtree, is a professor of animal science at Michigan State University, where he holds the Charles Stewart Mott Distinguished Professorship for Sustainable Agriculture. Dr. Roundtree's research focuses on identifying the metrics and management that reflect ecological improvement in grazing lands and other agricultural systems. Dr. Roundtree has given presentations throughout the United States, Australia, Canada, Europe, Saudi Arabia, Africa, and New Zealand. Dr. Roundtree has led or been co-investigator on $27.75 million in funding to conduct food systems research. Dr. Roundtree is also the co-director of the Center of Regenerative Agriculture at Michigan State University. His work in beef sustainability was featured in the movie The Sacred Cow, and he too has been highlighted in the Washington Post, New York Times, Forbes, and many other popular media publications. And our final expert joining us today, Dr. Paige Stanley, is a rangeland soil biogeochemist and research scientist at Colorado State University, working to understand how grazing management influences ecosystem and soil processes governing soil carbon sequestration and stabilization. With a BS in biology and economics from Georgia College, an MS in animal science from Michigan State, and a PhD in environmental science from UC Berkeley, and a postdoc in soil and crop science at Colorado State University, Dr. Stanley leverages her interdisciplinary background to approach research through a combined lens of soil biogeochemistry, rangeland ecology, rancher sociology and social science, animal science, and plant ecophysiology. Core to Dr. Stanley's work is centering ranchers through the research process to ensure her work is equitable, informed, and applicable to working landscapes as social ecological systems. Through understanding soil carbon outcomes from grazing management, understanding soil carbon outcomes from grazing management is the main pillar of Dr. Stanley's research. She also works on synergistic projects to optimize soil carbon management, monitoring methods, and heterogeneous rangeland systems, understanding drivers and barriers to ranchers' adoption of adaptive grazing methods, and to drive science-informed policy for more resilient rangelands in the face of climate change. So without further ado, I will call on Dr. Jeff Goodwin to kick us off on our informational session, and then we'll get into some Q&A.
Well, thank you, Sam. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, wherever you are. Honored to speak with you today. It's often difficult to synthesize 50 years of research into a handful of 5 or 6 slides, but that's what we're going to try to do today. And largely, I just want to kind of keep the conversation here at a large scale, right? So broadly discussing today the implementation of grazing management on grazing lands. We want to talk about the current science, potential research gaps, key challenges that we likely all see in doing grazing management research, and then some ideas around future direction. What do we need to do to move the discipline forward and meet some of these, help the Roundtable and others meet many of the sustainability goals that have been outlined across the industry. Next slide. So why grazing management, right? So we've talked about land. We're going to talk about water and greenhouse gases. Why this one management practice? When we think about grazing management, it's the primary driver or primary management practice that's applied across 655 million acres of grazing lands. You can see the variability across the landscape in terms of land cover from this graphic. It also is the primary supporting management practice for almost 770 beef cattle businesses or enterprises across the United States. I'm framing most of my comments around the U.S. Today too, by the way. And so it's also a significant management practice that drives the economics of many of these industries. So the beef industry in the United States, 165 billion acres or dollars annually. And also we can't, sort of leave out one of the key drivers of grazing management on grazing lands is their impact on wildlife habitat, which is almost a $400 billion industry. And so that's why grazing management is one of the practices that we throw in here. What are the sort of the key things that we know about management on grazing lands, and where are the gaps? Next slide. And so let's just back up and see if we can agree on some things on what do we know. We know that there's this social perception that cattle production, if you will, impacts the climate, right? We can potentially argue that it has positive and or negative impacts, right? But I think it's pretty well known that grazing management has been proposed as a potential solution to mitigate many of these impacts. And a number of papers have supported that. I think we also know that stocking rate, just base stocking rate, is a key driver in animal performance. It's a driver of productivity, and it's a driver for ecological health. A number of papers have supported this. So stocking rate, or the balance of animal demand and forage supply, is one of the key metrics to get us started. If we're out of grass and we're overstocked, it really doesn't matter what strategy you're trying to employ. It doesn't matter how close the cows are standing to each other. And so stocking rate's one of the sort of the key drivers that we start with, right? Then we move up and from there. Ecological context is another item that I think we all agree it's important to consider with these alternative grazing management strategies. Now, the strategies that we might employ in Mississippi or Florida, for instance, may be slightly different than how we might implement those practices in another part of the country in a more drier climate, because the ecological context is very different. I think we're also very aware that there's a significant amount of anecdotal evidence of the socio-ecological benefits of certain grazing strategies. We see successful ranchers applying these practices, but they may or may not have the scientific rigor or data to support, or it hasn't been published in some paper, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests that grazing management provides a number of socio-ecological benefits. Next. So let's talk about the state of the science. I hope most of us agree that if you've reviewed the literature, you can find papers that support the implementation of grazing management and some that don't. There's really not a consensus on the socio-ecological impacts of alternative grazing management strategies. That's just where we are. You can find papers on both sides. I do think that we're seeing a number of papers come out that supports the idea of having some sort of an adaptive strategy. So adaptive management has largely been considered most recently as a key principle in grazing management. And this is the idea of data-driven decision-making, or monitoring, reacting, and then basing or alternating, adaptively implementing management changes based on data that we've gathered. The problem in the literature too, though, is that we've got divergent definitions or opinions on what constitutes adaptive grazing management. And so there are actually systems that would, like adaptive multi-paddock or AMP grazing, but how those are applied in the literature are different. So there are a number of studies that have actually applied adaptive management as its overarching framework, involving producers, monitoring and monitoring metrics, and then altering their management based on that. In other ways, in other studies, they have really characterized adaptive management into specific measures, right? Whether it be stock density or number of paddocks or daily moves, and they've characterized adaptive management in that way. So they're not exactly the same. It's great work. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying anything. There's any problem with these papers. It's just that they're applying it in a somewhat different way. I also think that there's a lot of broadly yet discrete characterizing of grazing management strategies in the science today. And so rather than appreciating sort of that inherent complexity of what goes into a grazing strategy, we're creating these boundaries, and they're really undefined. So whether it be AMP grazing or whether it be even conventional, what does conventional even mean? Some studies have characterized conventional and included rotational and season-long set stock in the same sort of bucket. And so I think it's a disservice to understanding really the complexity of the management by comparing these large buckets because there's so much variation, even in the conventional bucket. I also think we've, from a socioeconomic perspective, there's a lot of, again, anecdotal data, and there's only really a handful of papers out there that have truly investigated those socioeconomic benefits of adaptive grazing management. When we step back and start looking at it, the socioeconomic benefits are largely, in my opinion, going to influence the adoption and removal of the barriers for adoption. So I think there needs to be more emphasis on these socioeconomic benefits. If a landowner is having a trouble, implementing a specific practice, economics are going to be a significant driver in a number of those. And so I think more work is needed there. Next. And so just flowing on into sort of the knowledge gaps here, I think there's some significant gaps around the actual implementation of adaptive management and its influence on what we call grazing management levers. And so each of these systems, quote unquote, are largely driven by 5 things: the timing of the grazing, the intensity in which the landscape or paddock level is grazed, the frequency in which, how often that paddock is grazed, the duration, and how much rest. And so instead of bucketing our interpretations and systems, we really need to understand those drivers, the management levers that a landowner or a land manager are actually using to implement that strategy. And they're not static, right? They should be adaptive in and of themselves. And so another gap is the interaction and the fluctuation of those levers. And so how does timing and intensity work together, or rest and frequency? And then the interaction and the fluctuation of those levers, the influence on soils, ecosystem services, and profitability. We haven't discerned that through much of the science, and I think that's a serious gap that future research in grazing management really needs to begin to focus on. I also think that there's a gap around the recognition and definition of a grazing management strategies as a continuum. So we've got, let's just say, for instance, adaptive multi-paddock grazing on one end of the spectrum, and then continuous season-long grazing on the other end of the spectrum. That's absolutely what it is, because every other strategy is somewhere in between. Instead of some undefined sort of bucketed system that we really can't dive into the understanding the impacts of those individual levers, understanding that grazing management is a continuum across ecology and space and time is important for us to look at moving forward. And then again, back to the socioeconomic drivers and barriers to adoption. If in fact we've proven that grazing management can provide these socioeconomic benefits, then why isn't everyone doing it? And so I think there's still a lot of room for us to learn what the actual drivers are of producers picking up these practices and implementing them at scales that can make an impact. Next slide. And so I've identified a few key challenges that I think are important. Number one is funding availability for ranch scale research. And these are looking at these impacts at the ranch scale, not necessarily the plot scale. So doing work on the ranches that are successfully implementing grazing management. I also think there's been hundreds of millions of dollars spent recently on implementation, on working towards getting more implementation out on the ground, but we still have research questions that we need to answer. So funding of availability of ranch scale research is very different than implementation. Collecting grazing management data from producers. If we're going to study successful operations, we have to have, instead of always relying on a producer to update a spreadsheet or fill out a grazing management platform, technology that could help us gather the timing, intensity, frequency, grazing in an automated way would really help us. There's a number of issues with collecting grazing management data from producers, and we can get into those in the discussion, but that's been a challenge for us. Again, the context dependent nature of grazing outcomes. Um, Many times we talk about grazing principles. Well, those principles may apply to broader landscapes, but the context in which they're applied or implemented is going to be different. Then there's the inherent variability and complexity of the strategy itself. So there's a significant amount of variability there. The last two here, actionable producer relevant findings. I think we focus too many times on finding a significant p-value rather than asking the right questions to get actionable, applied, producer relevant findings where the actual outcome that we find can be implemented at the ranch scale for a rancher to make a decision. And then lastly, again, producer adoption. How do we get more people how do we provide the science to make it a relevant, to make the grazing management information that we're providing to a group of producers relevant that they'll apply it. Next slide. A couple of potential solutions is work towards defining that grazing continuum based on the interaction between those levers. I think if we can get back and focus on those 5 drivers of grazing management, we can begin to understand and look at things through a prescriptive approach versus an adaptive approach. And having all of those levers will help us to discern what really is the footprint of a particular ranch or operation. What is really driving those outcomes? Affordable, automated grazing management data collection. That's a technology solution likely. Coordinated interdisciplinary long-term grazing management research. We looked at some of the recent work. Most of the grazing studies that have been put out are 2 or 3 years. Well, many of these indicators that we're looking at are lagging indicators. They take a long time to change over time. And so 2 to 3 year research projects really aren't going to help us answer that. And so secondly, the integration of actual grazing management data coupled with the ecologic and socioeconomic outcomes collectively. And so there's a lot of work out there that has looked at the grazing management impacts on soils or on water or on biodiversity, productivity, profitability, but not so much collectively. And so larger scale research projects that integrate in a interdisciplinary way to focus on those broader impacts are absolutely needed. And then again, more work on defining and removing the barriers to adoption of adaptive grazing management. Next. So I wanted to say a couple of words about the actual goal of the roundtable. 385 million acres of grazing management plans written. And so I have a couple of questions with that. Number one, what is the effectiveness of a grazing management plan? It's really the implementation of that plan that provides the outcomes. And then what's those drivers to adoption of having a plan that's written versus one that's in their head, for instance. Very little research exists on the effectiveness of a written grazing plan. I think we could all agree that it's the first step in managing grazing, of having some sort of a plan, but it's more about the planning and the implementation than the plan. There's limited understanding on what drives a producer to have a written plan. I would say that if we're going to move down the road of having that plan, the implementation should be tied to some measured or monitored outcomes. That's the foundation of adaptive management. And so I think from a next step perspective, if we're going to talk about the goal of the roundtable, I think a good first step is to promote having a written plan, because that means that producer has gone through the planning phases and they've thought about implementation, they've thought about the planning pieces, but where do we go from here? I think that's just our first step, and moving forward, we've got to have definable ways to quantify those outcomes. I don't want to get into the other two speakers, so I think I'll stop with that there. Next. I think that's all I have regarding grazing management. I don't know if we're going to do questions. I think we're going to do questions at the end. If not, I'll stop and say thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, we'll keep questions till the end, and I'll pass it off here to Dr. Roundtree.
Howdy, y'all. It's certainly a pleasure to chat today. Obviously thankful to the Roundtable and FFAR for the invite. And I've spent quite a few years trying to more aptly understand how management influences the metrics of ecological systems and grazing systems specifically. And the longer I do this, sometimes I think the less I know. So I try to come at it from a point of being just a bit humble, because it's a complex natural system. And as we study these systems, there's always so much to learn. And I'll lean on it a little bit, but I also had the opportunity to lead a project with the FFAR that is entitled Metrics Management and Monitoring Grazing Systems. I do this in a co-director format with Dr. Goodwin, as well as Francesca Catrufo, working with Paige Stanley. And so some of my insights are kind of gleaned from us being in our 4th year, working on 60 sites throughout the United States. And so before I get there, I thought maybe just from a beef supply or ag supply chain, I'd like to kind of set the stage up on a few things. And so if you could go to the next slide, please. I go to this considerably. There's a recent report by the FAIRR. If you're not aware of FAIRR, I'd recommend Googling them. They are a conglomerate of NGOs that are backed by about 70 trillion worth of income, and they work closely with the FAO and others, and recently put out a summary of where we are with regenerative agriculture in our food system. And so they surveyed 79 companies worth around 3 trillion, and found that of those 79 companies, 50 of them actually mention regenerative ag initiatives in their disclosures. Primarily, they were focused on soil health and soil carbon. Of the 50 that positively affirmed, regenerative agriculture initiatives, 36% of them have actually quantified company-wide targets. Only 8 of the 50 actually discuss metrics and data, with only 4 companies having established baselines to measure progress. And then finally, of the 50, only 4 of them have begun to develop targets to financially support farmers to deploy regenerative practices. And this is a multiple kind of point, I think, data set here. First of all, I think it shows that food-based companies are looking to regenerative ag significantly to help them offset emissions and increase resilience in their supply chain. I think, at first when I kind of looked at number 5 and said, okay, well, only 4 out of 50 are actually working to pay. First, I kind of thought, oh, well, maybe this is like a form of greenwashing. I've also since spoke with considerable international companies about this, and really one comment that's consistent is that companies today don't know what to do. So it isn't the fact that they're not willing to pay, it's they don't know what to do. They don't know how to pay. They don't know what to pay for. And I think those are all very significant and also give opportunities for our research. Next slide, please. This is kind of a summary of a current walkabout I've gone on the last few years as we built the MSU Center for Regenerative Ag. And over the last few years, I've spent quite a bit of time working with big companies, working with small farms, large farms, a variety of global agriculture. And I did so kind of to learn about, what are the gaps and what are the areas that I think as we look at land, as we look at resilience and productivity long term, what are challenges that we see today? And for instance, how could our center or other research be able to help address that? One thing that has been consistent to me is that the data and the metrics and the things we chase in research, the needs of a supply chain, and the conversations we have in agriculture all still stay pretty separate. And I think that just shows that we're still kind of in this silo. And because of that, I think we have limited communication and shared understanding. What might mean resilience for a ranch is a completely different thing for a supply chain. A supply chain says, hey, we want a product delivered at this point, at this price point, whenever we need that product. And that speaks very different to what we might consider to be resilience at a ranch level, when we're talking about the ability for land to snap back after a challenge like a drought or fire or flood or maybe a income-based type of challenge. And so to me, there still is a disconnect when we think about that entire complex supply chain. Sam had a really nice slides showing the beef supply chain in her slides. And what we're dealing with is complex. And so I think moving forward, it's very important that we try to shore up our communication, that we have shared understanding, and we begin to use the same types of language to define our challenges. We know there are challenges in sustainability. They're here. They have been here. They're going to continue to be there. And in order to rectify this, we continually see more and more complex legislation. I think that, and then its ultimate implementation and measurement, has us all kind of wondering what's next, right? We have these political landscapes that see pendulums shift from the left to the right to the center and back and forth. And how does a corporation make longer term decisions based on that uncertainty? We are also seeing a rise in transparency expectations when it comes to making emission reduction claims. That is seen by potential lawsuits that are circulating today. Companies that have made these highly bold pledges without a transparent and methodological way of getting there. Again, huge opportunities that I see for research, specifically for us in the beef supply chain. I've also noticed from the ranch level all the way to the consumer that there is a continued call to action, that we need to continue to work and expedite and really work towards improving mitigation efforts when it comes to land and these challenges we see with water, biodiversity, land use, and other things. I think it's important, and I really want to say this, that we should prioritize resilience and adaptation. We often get to chasing a CO2 metric, for example, as this benefit of worth or this metric of worth that's somehow going to save us. A CO2 equivalent will not save us, okay? And it's clear in that. And so as we think about what types of data we need from land, we need to be thinking about the integrated response variables that lead us to resilience. And again, I see our research multiple folds, but one is going to be continually driving what the measurement, monitoring, reporting, and verification of ecosystem benefits on land are. And that's going to be very important. And then how do we, as Jeff kind of indicated, foster independence? I think that's huge for our ranchers in the United States, as really specifically. And the fact that we don't want to create situations where ranchers feel like they're being spied on, they're being cornered into reporting metrics that they feel like might hurt them financially, other things. And so I think it's important that we foster independence in our work, that we continually work to improve land, and then likewise ensure food security. Next slide, please. And so how do we see this shift in getting to land? In the beef industry, we've hung our hat on efficiency, and we've made tremendous improvements in the efficiency of beef. We've hyper focused on an output per unit input, and that has been how we have measured sustainability. I'm going to challenge us a little bit in a minute. But one thing that I am seeing today, and maybe this is subjective, is often in the food industry, we want to keep our eye on that issue of efficiency, but we kind of want to put a little lipstick on it too, and kind of redress it maybe as the new term. And so often today I see, oh, well, we're going to talk about regenerative, et cetera. But really it might be just feeding some new supplement or doing some gene edits or other things. And that's all great stuff, but that's really driven towards improving efficiencies. And I'm not sure that really meets these ideas of what we think about in regenerative ag and soil health principles, okay? And then finally, we have a lot of data that's beginning to show that as we do chase efficiencies on the cow-calf side, often we're seeing leakages. And those leakages typically are methane driven in our context. And so I think what we need to do is obviously always keep focused on that output per unit input, but begin to consider, especially as we do work on land, as putting land and natural resources in the farthest denominator. So we don't just have an output per input, and we need that, but we also have this output per input per unit soil carbon, per unit water conserved, per unit biodiversity, and other metrics that give more important indicators of resilience. We begin to more aptly understand the true circularity of energy in our systems, which is going to be the energy in and energy out of these systems. And so we begin to think about our output and input, but we actually tie it to the natural resource. And it isn't just hovering in space in terms of efficiencies. I'll be the first to say this is very hard to do and it's tough to measure. But I think if we get there, we have a true indicator of then what works at the ranch level, what works at the feed yard, and what works all the way through for our consumers as well. Next slide, please. So this is an idea just to show you of what we're measuring with our existing FAR grant that we have. We are on 60 sites throughout Michigan, Wyoming, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Texas. We have really yielded a team that kind of has thrown the kitchen sink at ecological metrics. Paige will talk more too. Jeff has been working on what I would call that farthest numerator that I just talked about, where he's constantly getting yield information and grazing data information, so we kind of understand what those outputs are at the ranch scape. But even in that context, and all this work that we're working on a $19 million funded project, there's still gaps that are out there. We want to be able to understand more aptly in your shoes what you see those gaps are. And I'm going to share maybe just a few of what I've seen kind of in our work and other work that I've done. If you could go to the next slide, please. So one area that really has dawned on me in our work with ranchers, they're much more focused on obviously their profitability and the resilience of their land and that land carrying them into future generations. We are seeing producers, I think, that are getting much more keen to wanting to understand what ecosystem markets look like, whether that be carbon or water or biodiversity and others. At the same time, it seems fairly clear that our supply chains, while they want that resilience and they want their products, they're very focused on emission reductions. And those are two different things. And so one of the key areas that is kind of been gleaned upon for me and others in my walk is how can we begin to do both? How can we begin to not only try to more aptly work with ranchers to understand the metrics of resilience, but how do we at that ranch level simultaneously begin to understand what opportunities are for emission reductions and bring that together to inform? From a data perspective, the metrics that drive rancher resilience or biodiversity and other things are different at scale from what a supply chain needs. And that's another challenge that I've seen. So let's say that we're on a 5 or 10,000 acre ranch. Well, that ranch manager is going to want to know how their movement, how their rest recovery, how these other aspects are influencing the amount of grass they grow, the amount of cows they can run, the amount of weaning weight that they have to market, for example. Normally a supply chain isn't concerned about one ranch. They might be concerned about 1,000 or 10,000. And so how we accumulate the metrics is super important, because the way that we might go about monitoring and understanding what happens at one ranch is very different at a watershed or a regional basis. And that's why we need as solid and as good and continuing modeling, I think, in this context moving forward. That we begin to understand opportunities of melding on ranch site type information with what we might be able to glean from a much larger scale. And so how do we accrue the right data? How do we begin to evaluate that data to be able to create systems that can inform both? The third area I think that we continually, and obviously we have a module dedicated to water with the Roundtable FFAR collaborative, but is more aptly understanding biodiversity. I go to meetings, I work with folks, and biodiversity continues to be a word that we hear that is so inherent to resilience and well-being. And how do we create opportunities that begin to help us measure that better? Most all of these aspects of biodiversity require super heavy lifting from a monitoring perspective, where you've got on-site monitors looking at biodiversity. How do we begin to scale that up more appropriately, that we can use remote sensing and other technologies and opportunities to be able to scale these things up? And so what approaches accurately depict these changes in biodiversity and water, and how do we scale? And so continuing to harness monitoring strategies that focus on biodiversity, water, as well as carbon, I think are going to be highly needed. And so with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. We will pass it on to our final expert presentation today, Dr. Stanley. Go ahead.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for being here and for the Roundtable and FFAR for organizing. This is really exciting to see so much interest and the number of attendees that are here. And soil carbon is certainly having its day in the sun. But anyway, to see so many people here, I think is really heartening. Go ahead. Okay, so I think most of us are probably all on the same page, but I might just start by covering a couple topics on why soil carbon is important in the space. I think, we're all here because we're interested in beef sustainability, greenhouse gas emissions, ecosystem services, and how we can meet all of those goals in one fell swoop. Jeff had a couple of really fantastic slides on the scale and scope of grazing lands in the US. But roughly a third of all of our agricultural or our total land on Earth, somewhere between a third and a half, depending on who's quantifying it, is grazing land. And I'm using grazing land as a bit of an umbrella term to cover pasture, grassland, rangeland. But across those lands where ruminants graze, we've lost a significant amount of soil carbon. So those lands hold a lot of soil carbon. They've also lost a lot of soil carbon. And so we have this unique opportunity to try and sequester soil carbon, so put some of that carbon back. And so it's a great time to be in this space. But I think, there's a couple of important reasons why that's an important goal to have, that we should be focusing on soil carbon as part of our greenhouse gas mitigation strategy in terms of beef production. One is that soil carbon is directly connected to soil health. So soil health is really important to producers, but soil carbon is what I like to think of as a bit of a master indicator of soil health broadly. And that's because soil carbon drives, either directly or indirectly, a lot of the soil health processes that we're interested in. So things like water holding capacity and retention, cation exchange capacity, productivity, nutrient cycling, and things of the like. And so myself and my research tends to focus on soil carbon, but it has implications above and beyond just the carbon itself. The second reason why soil carbon is important in the space is because it relates to a lot of our climate goals. So sequestering soil carbon can help mitigate climate change in terms of soil carbon sequestration, so pulling down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and holding on to it in the form of soil carbon. And increasing soil carbon stocks on grazing lands also has a lot of importance in terms of adaptive capacity and resilience of grazing land ecosystems. And lastly, producer profitability. I think soil health is important for producers because they want to know how they can reduce their input costs and rely more on their natural resource base. But right now is a really unique time in the space because we're seeing the emergence of a lot of market opportunities like soil carbon offsets and crediting, biodiversity credits, ecosystem service credits, things of the like. And so, we have an opportunity to leverage soil carbon potentially to help increase producer profitability, not only indirectly through productivity, but also more directly through things like soil carbon credits. So what do we know? And these are some pretty broad stroke things. And I'm speaking in these broad strokes, mainly because I want to have a great discussion afterwards. And I've seen a couple of really great questions already come through in the chat, so please keep them coming. But there's a couple of things that we know to be true. One is that improved grazing land management can help sequester soil carbon and improve soil health. So that's in the broadest terms possible. That is one thing that we know to be true. But the extent to which we can sequester soil carbon with things like improved grazing management depends on a lot of abiotic and edaphic factors, things like climate, so temperature and precipitation regimes, land use history. So, for example, was that land maybe previously cropped, or how much soil carbon has a given plot of land lost? How much more potential does it have to sequester carbon versus is it at something like a steady state equilibrium? So is the amount of carbon going in and out roughly the same? Type of management improvement. So there are, like Jeff mentioned earlier in his presentation, there are many iterations of improved grazing management. And there are some forms and some ecosystems that might give us a greater propensity to sequester soil carbon than maybe others. And lastly, I think just producer to producer, variability matters a lot in this space. And I've done quite a lot of social science, so I like to continually bring this kind of producer forward perspective. But what I mean to say here is that the capacity with which individual producers have to adapt their management and meet ecological goals like soil carbon depends a lot individually on the producer. The capacity that they have to experiment and fail, and how patient they are with trying and trying and trying again with their grazing management strategies. That is a highly individualistic producer question. And then lastly, what I'll mention here in terms of what we know is that soil carbon sequestration has lots of co-benefits, but one of those co-benefits is that it can help us potentially partially offset greenhouse gas footprints of livestock production systems. So if we think of soil carbon drawdown as a net negative on the entire greenhouse gas footprint of a production system, how much of that greenhouse gas footprint can we offset through soil carbon sequestration? And like I just mentioned, that depends a lot on the system and the grazing management and all of those things. But what we know is that it's very unlikely to completely offset the entire greenhouse gas footprint of a grazing animal. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that and Jason as well later. Okay, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, I actually have synthesized in a recent publication earlier this year, so I'm putting this here as just a plug. But there's a couple, I think, of key points on soil carbon and grazing management that we do know, but again, in broad strokes. The first is that there are generally good and bad strategies, grazing management strategies for soil carbon sequestration in any ecological context. And these are influenced by the grazing management levers that Jeff brought up earlier. So things like intensity, timing, frequency, and duration. So these are things above and beyond just the presence or absence of a grazing animal, or maybe even just simply the stocking rate, even though we know that is influential. And those aspects of grazing management, so those individual levers and the extent to which we pull on them, influence several pathways of soil carbon sequestration. And so these are things like, what is happening between the cow and the plant and the soil. So grazing influences things like canopy cover, productivity, plant diversity, the input quality of the plants to the soil. Those are the kind of ecosystem movers and shakers in terms of soil carbon. So we know pretty much that. And that when we trickle down to the soil carbon level, once carbon gets into soil, it's not all made equally. There are what we call fractions of soil carbon that can tell us a lot about what that carbon is doing in the soil, how long it's likely to stay, and what we can do to maintain or accumulate carbon in those different fractions that have varying levels of importance. So if you're interested in the specifics of mechanisms of grazing management and pathways of soil carbon accumulation and change, I would really recommend you go read this paper, but I'm also happy to discuss more about these things later. Okay, and much to my dismay, and I'm sure all of you who are listening in, I think the biggest elephant in the room is that we still don't have any scientific consensus on when, how much, and what drives or limits the potential of grazing management to sequester soil carbon. And I'll touch on a little bit about why that is in the coming up slides. So that's what we know, the overarching kind of lack of consensus, I'll say. And so what are the big buckets of what we don't know? One is that we don't really understand or don't have a lot of data to support the influence of grazing management on soil carbon over time. So when we think about soil carbon sequestration, that requires at least two measurement times. So you've got to go out and measure baseline or at some point in time, then you've got to come back after a certain amount of years or time and remeasure that soil carbon to be able to get that delta or the change over time. And that's what's important for climate change goals, for carbon offsets, is that delta number. But what we mostly have are data that are point in time. So researchers or ranchers or NGOs or even industries who have gone out to farms and ranches and collected soil carbon data at just one point in time. So that tells us carbon stock, but not change over time. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is in the coming up slides, but that's a giant research gap that we have. Second is we don't have a lot of clear mechanistic data. So those are things like, what extent are those individual grazing management levers influencing the pathways of soil carbon change? And that's what we really need to understand, the important parts of those levers that we need to be influencing in terms of adoption. That also drives producer feedback tools, so things that we can really do to help producers in terms of helping teach them or even educate them, or us learning about the how of grazing management and soil carbon sequestration. That is we're hard pressed on that in the literature right now. We also need to understand how those mechanistic levers vary over the range of grazing land ecosystems that we have. So for example, grazing management strategies that are effective at sequestering soil carbon in a temperate pasture-based system like Michigan will be very different than a semi-arid rangeland steppe, for example, that we have across Colorado and Wyoming. And so how those levers vary and the potential with which they can influence pathways of soil carbon change is also a big challenge for us right now in the literature. And then lastly, there's I think one big challenge that we have is measurement optimization. So grazing lands typically do not play nice when we try to copy and paste soil carbon measurement strategies that were originally adopted on croplands and apply them to grazing lands. And so it's not impossible to do, but measuring things like soil carbon and soil carbon change on grazing land tend to be a lot more challenging for that reason. Okay, so now we've got a picture of what we know, what we don't know, and so what's holding us back? Why haven't we managed to fill these research gaps? There's a couple of reasons. One is sampling density, and I feel like if I could shout anything from the rooftops, it would be this: to collect more soil samples. So rangelands, grazing lands in general tend to be very heterogeneous. So there's a lot of variability inherent to the soil carbon on these landscapes over both space and time. And so the amount of soil samples that we would need to collect to get an accurate estimate is a lot. So detecting and quantifying that soil carbon change over time is something akin to finding a needle in a haystack, and you need a lot of samples to be able to do that. The other thing is measurement accuracy. Grazing lands tend to keep us on our toes when it comes to soil carbon. That's because there's just a lot of cool and unique features to them. Things like rocks and coarse fragments, plant litter, slope, all of these things that pose challenges to us, and we need to think about stratifying and soil processing carefully. And so getting that accurate estimate is a lot more of a challenge logistically and mentally, emotionally, all the ways than we, I think, in the soil carbon space have been used to. Third is the scale and scope of research. Both Jeff and Jason touched on this. The rates of soil carbon accumulation that we would typically expect from a grazing management improvement tend to be low and slow. So that's not to say that it's not possible or that it's not worth pursuing. It certainly is, especially considering the extent of grazing lands that we have, and that grazing animals are a lever that are already in the hands of producers. And so the potential that improved grazing management poses to soil carbon sequestration is giant, but it takes a lot more patience and critical thought in terms of how we measure it. So we need research for longer and at ranch scales. And that's because, and Jeff touched on this a bit too, we have a lot of evidence to suggest that the data that we have from small experimental approaches to understanding grazing and soil carbon don't quite match what we tend to see on farm and ranch scale grazing ecosystems. And so, if you think about grazing animals and their behavior, it tends to change a lot when you put 2 animals on a small experimental controlled replicated block design than what a producer is using grazing animals to achieve at the ranch scale. And so we need to have some of that too. Lastly is connecting grazing. And so this might seem intuitive, just as all of us have presented and thought through this today, but researchers and producers have not overlapped in terms of this like mechanistic soil carbon question really until recently. And so a lot of the data that we have right now are, simple presence absence data. So it's soil carbon measured over time from a grazing exclosure or grazing animals in general, but we don't yet have a lot of research to draw on in which grazing management has really been characterized well and to help us really understand what's going on deep down in terms of the grazing and the soil carbon. Okay, next slide. So I've kind of bucketed what we need moving forward in terms of 2 categories. This is all of the things we need in terms of MRV, so monitoring, research, verification. The first and lowest hanging fruit, I think, is just more data. We need more data, and there's no way to overcome that at this point in time. We need more data, both in terms of pure measurement, but also to inform ecosystem models, and so to project these changes over time. So the first is soil carbon data over time. There's no getting around the measure and remeasure that we need to understand soil carbon sequestration. We need much more of that. And we need it both from replicated, controlled experimental designs to get at that mechanistic question, and also at ranch scale. So whether this means expanding experimental plots to be larger, or I think more likely and what would be better is just research partnering with actual farms and ranches to measure soil carbon changes on real working lands. And we also need that happening across the different grazing land ecosystems that we know exist. Second is better quality data. And that's not to say that we don't have any high quality data right now, but high quality data is certainly harder to find amongst the literature. And so that means collecting many, many, many more samples to get a really robust and accurate measurement of soil carbon change over time. And having that paired with detailed grazing management information, that way, at the end of the day, we have something to say about the who, what, when, where, why of that soil carbon delta. And lastly, I think there's the variability and challenges that come with grazing land ecosystems make it really ripe for technology developments, for research investment. And that's because we know that it's very expensive to do the gold standard measurement approach on these landscapes, given how many samples we need to take. There are technological innovations that I think are coming down the pipeline relatively quickly that aren't there yet, that could really improve the accuracy and speed with which we are able to understand these changes in soil carbon on grazing land. So that's things like spectroscopy. I'm very interested to see where the space takes us in terms of measuring things like rock volume, which tends to be important for measuring bulk density or how much soil there is in a given space. And so that's I'm excited to know that there are things happening there, but we're still waiting on that to really come through. Okay, next slide. Okay, and these are some kind of bigger ideas for how do we get to where we're going in terms of understanding grazing management and soil carbon change. One is we need better coordination of existing data. Right now, I'd already mentioned that very little data exists in terms of soil carbon change over time from grazing management. But it does exist in some places. It's just a little dispersed. So, for example, we've got biophysical data that are owned by private companies, by nonprofits. For example, Point Blue Conservation Science in California has measured soil carbon for the past 10 years on more than 100 ranches in the state. Long-term agroecological research stations, little pockets of data exist in all of these places, and we don't yet have a good way to coordinate all of our research efforts. And that, I think, would get us a long way to where we're going. And Jeff and Jason both mentioned that existing grazing management data are at least as equally as sparse. But there are opportunities to pull on those data where they do exist. So, for example, there are grazing record-keeping platforms like Maya and Pasture Map that are really rich with information. And so, what could we do to leverage these data, pull them all together into a space that could support things like producer decision support tools or even research inquiries? So I think, that is something I see as a challenge, not even just particularly among the grazing space, but in the soil carbon space in general. Second is continuation and expansion of the new and improved research that we've got going on. So both Jeff and Jason mentioned the 3M project that all of us work on together. It's honestly the most incredible project I've ever worked on in my life. But I think what I'll say about it is that the lessons that we've learned in terms of measuring ecosystem response to grazing management, given all of the challenges that we've highlighted this morning, have prompted the development of the 3M project. And so we're working on bridging a lot of these gaps, but we need more support to be able to continue that research in a way that allows us to measure these things for a longer period of time and over a broader scale of grazing land ecosystem. So we're almost there, but we could use more support to get exactly to where we're going. And then lastly, I think I'm certainly heartened by all of the incredible thought leaders in the space, many of which are on this call. But we need really thoughtful exploration of important mechanisms. So there's a reason why a lot of our experimental data in terms of grazing management and soil carbon has left us with a lot of remaining questions. And so I think thinking outside of the box and applying research in a way that's going to help us get there. So things like more on-ranch measurement, or more carefully considering what stocking rate actually means in experimental settings. So we need a lot more of that to get at these mechanistic questions, which is really the next frontier in terms of influencing grazing management. And it's just as a little, nuggets of what that could look like, it could be something like, mediators of soil carbon response. So for example, how does aridity influence opportunities for carbon sequestration from grazing management? What are the influence of roots and microbes? So we know that they're really influential, but to what extent in grazing land ecosystems? We know that things are changing pretty rapidly. Producers on the ground face climatic variation every day in terms of their grazing land ecosystems, which makes adaptivity so important. But what does that look like under future projected climate change? So as places get wetter in some cases or more arid in some cases, what do opportunities and potentials look like then? And lastly, I'll mention that most of our soil carbon research over the past 100 years or so has been only in the top 30 centimeters of soil, but we know that soil carbon responses in deeper depths are equally as important. And so we need a lot more research to understand how grazing management is influencing some of that deep soil carbon as another research frontier. Okay, so there's my contact information if ever anybody has questions, and I'll end there, but looking forward to the panel discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Paige. I'll welcome Jeff and Jason back on here. Thank you all so much for your presentation. That was a lot of fantastic content, a lot of shared themes. I think things I was hearing a lot was data, which I think we can all appreciate. We hear pretty much ad nauseum at this point, more data, more accurate data, better definition of metrics that we can be using to actually support producers in making decisions, and things that are going to help us inform more predictive models so we can be scaling a little bit more. So technology playing a big role here as well, potentially. I'll open it up to discussion. I don't know, Jeff, Jason, or Paige, if there's anything that struck you across your 3 presentations that you want to highlight. We do have a couple of questions, but I think we've pretty well answered them in the chat. So I'll pause here for any feedback from you 3.
I do see just the most recent question from Christian. I can take a stab at that.
Yep.
Okay, so the question is asking about the comment I made on carbon neutrality or being carbon negative in terms of regenerative grazing, what that means for life cycle assessments. And the question is, are regenerative grass-fed and finished products not carbon neutral or negative? Is grass finishing a viable climate solution? It's a bit of a loaded question, and so I'll try to answer it quickly and succinctly. Also, Jason and Jeff, please feel free to chime in. So I think the long and short of it is probably not, but it depends a lot on the system. So typically grass fed and finished and even regeneratively grazed beef tends to have a larger greenhouse gas footprint in some respects. So for example, the methane footprint tends to be a little bit larger. And so it requires even more soil carbon drawdown to be able to offset those things. And this is not to say that, I don't necessarily think that grazing systems need to be climate neutral or negative in order to be an ecological positive in terms of soil carbon, but the challenges are large. And so for the footprint to be completely offset requires something like, a lot of soil carbon having been lost over the prior decade. So we need that delta to be really, really large. And that's really challenging in most grazing land ecosystems. So it might be more possible in something like a temperate landscape where the soil carbon accumulation potentials are much larger than, for example, in a semi-arid steppe. But at the end of the day, that very likely won't last forever. The rate of soil carbon accumulation does change over time. And so even if it might be carbon neutral or negative at the beginning, we don't yet know for how long that might last. And so I guess the long and short of it is it will help offset some of those greenhouse gas emissions, but the potentials for it to completely offset it are low and won't last forever if it is the case. Jason?
Yeah, I think you said it well, Paige. I mean, generally very high productive grass-based systems like grass finishing, you're still going to need 0.8 to 1 ton of carbon per hectare annually to probably break that entire footprint. And that's a lot over sustained period of time. Can it happen? Absolutely, in certain contexts, but to make bigger blanketed statements of grass versus grain or other things, I wouldn't recommend it. I think that perhaps the biggest opportunity for the beef industry is to think about what's possible on the cow-calf side and how that has the opportunity of offsetting emissions further down the supply chain. To me, that's like something, if we can combine those metrics, get those on track to where we can track that through the supply chain, then it's like high five, because that way there are, without question, realized opportunities of lowering what that footprint looks like. But it's done in a way that we're not sacrificing land use or productivity.
Can I just add that we seem to always be asking soil carbon sequestration to pay the whole bill, and that's only part of the story, right? There's so many operational efficiencies we need to work in here that and we've got to take the carbon blenders off. That's not the only thing that matters, right? You want me to get to Ashley's question next? Or
Sure.
is there other thoughts or questions on that?
I'll just add from that discussion between Paige and Jason that we do have our final focus group session will hone in a little bit more on the air and greenhouse gas side. I know Paige took a deep dive into soil carbon, but I think that that cow-calf point that Jason made will come into play with some of our experts on that discussion as well. So would encourage people to join on that call too. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment based on Ashley's question there about connecting funding with the corporate commitments and getting to this challenge of there being funding available for implementation, but not the research. There is funding going towards research. There's also a lot of money promoting the implementation of grazing management as a solution for a number of issues. Especially with the climate smart commodities grants and a number of recent USDA funding opportunities for on-farm trials, things of that nature. I think that's all great, and I hope we do more of that. But I don't want to get the cart before the horse either. We need to have the research either being applied at the same time or relatively or before, right? So I don't want to put it off because there's so many other benefits to managing these landscapes positively, using cattle as a tool to benefit a number of ecosystem services. Somebody asked the question earlier about what do we consider ecosystem services? Well, food and fiber is an ecosystem service. There's a number of cultural ecosystem services. It's not just carbon, right? Biodiversity, the provision of wildlife habitat. I think there's opportunity for us to utilize grazing as a tool in that space and things that we can do moving forward to implement sound management on the ground. But we still have to continue to ask the questions that we don't have answered. I don't know if that answered the question, but they need to be happening at the same time if we're going to move out implementation and research. Ideally, we do the research first, but we don't live in a perfect world.
Seeing some questions coming through the chat and others through the Q&A. I'm going to stick with the Q&A side for my brain to function a little easier here. So if you have questions, if you wouldn't mind putting them into the Q&A so we can track them a little easier, that'd be helpful. We have a question that came through while you were presenting, Paige. How are carbon offset registries being engaged so that we can match current state of science of carbon quantification with protocols development?
Yes. Let's see how to answer that one. So I think Jeff just kind of hit the nail on the head a bit when he said we can't put the cart before the horse. And so let's see. Carbon markets for soil carbon regularly do update their standard operating procedures for soil carbon measurement. So, what kind of bars and thresholds are we going to set for accurate soil carbon quantification? I think there's a lot changing in the space right now because I'd mentioned earlier in my slides that grazing lands tend to not play nice when we copy and paste the SOPs that were developed on croplands or what we thought was enough on croplands on grazing lands, because we have so many more challenges in these landscapes. And so, it's not enough, for example, just to take an average soil carbon at time 2 and subtract your average soil carbon at time 1. We know that is not enough to generate an accurate carbon credit, for example. And so there's a lot changing in those SOPs right now. So there are gold standards, industry gold standards like Vera, for example. But I think the things that we've been hearing anecdotally from ranchers for a really long time, researchers are only now starting to play catch up in terms of measurement. And so we've got quite the lag in terms of measuring the outcomes that ranchers have been reporting on. And that lag has never been more apparent than in the MRV soil carbon credit SOP space. And so I think a lot is changing. I think we will get there eventually, but you know, things are moving at a rapid fire right now in the carbon market space.
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, just to follow up, Paige nailed it. I would like to point to other countries I feel that are perhaps out there doing a bit better. Like I go to Australia, while they have their warts, okay. One of the key things in my mind is they have a defined methodology that's approved through the government. So it's more of a collective understanding that's transparent, that and then they have a regulatory and verification body within their government that registers carbon credits. They call them an ACCU, and each ranch has their own methane footprint that's calculated. So there are offs, you know, they do sub out, for example, enteric emissions at the ranch level. Very few, if any, of those sites are using nitrogen in their grazing land systems, so nitrous isn't a burden. And therefore have begun to use federal dollars to pay out credits to ranchers that are building carbon. I had the opportunity to go through and work with a lot of those ranches in the last year, and these guys are getting paid at a level where they're buying more land. But the key is it's transparent more so than anything else, and it's triggering an economic change. Even then, there's still pushback on, well, in time zero it was dry as hell, and time one it was wet, and is it management or is it rain, is it additionality, what? There's all those question marks out there. But even then, to me, what needs to happen here is we need a definable, transparent, process-based, policy-driven approach that makes everybody on the same playing field. So there's no doubts, there's no clouds, there's no my method or model are better than your method or model, etc. Not to get on a bit of a preach there, but we have a long way to go in the US compared to what other countries are doing, in my opinion. Is that okay, Paige, to say it that way? Okay.
Got a couple more questions in the Q&A. Question for all: what role do you see for genetics to interplay with grazing management for sustainability progress at the cow-calf level? And a follow-up with that is, how can we quantify the effects of genetics, both improve productivity and eventually for low methane emissions intensity? And
Great question.
I will
I'll
start this with
Yeah.
saying we do have a geneticist in our air and
Yeah,
greenhouse
coming
panel
right.
and he's
I'll
actually
I'll
on
keep
here
it
by
like
real quick.
cowboy simple for y'all, in my opinion. All right, versus I'm no gene jockey, but what I will say is that in a majority of the data out there, big cows are problematic, and our cows have gotten bigger, obviously through genetics, through management. And what I'd like to say is that I still see heterosis is a huge tool in all of this, right? Where we can keep a very moderate, energy efficient, profitable cow that has lower inputs, that I get more unit weaning weight per acre of land, but simultaneously be using the right types of bulls that can get it done on the feed yard side of the equation. And so I see that continuing as a huge opportunity. Obviously, we have enhanced EPDs and all these other wonderful tools in the toolbox that can really identify those. We have considerable data to suggest, as you know, our cows get larger, we see more energy leakages with methane per unit weaning weight on land, and I think that's going to be a pretty consistent find. So if we're not measuring it, then it's a challenge. I think also the continued, I know this isn't as much grazing land, but I think the continued beef on dairy is going to continue to be a big one as well genetically.
Anyone else want to add to that topic?
I think Jason did a great job.
And there's some really good genetics people on this call. If they would like to chime in, please do. I don't want to act like I'm the expert here or anything.
We will dive deeper into it. Troy, if you're on and would like to be unmuted, let us know, but we'll keep powering through here. Jason, do you think it's feasible to decouple carbon from the product, i.e. the calf or the final beef product, throughout the supply chain using blockchain technology like the one being proposed by the company Athion to MRV feed additives for the dairy sector?
Yeah, basically, I think what we're talking about is perhaps insetting versus offsetting, and the fact that, okay, well, how do you attach this potential benefit? Bottom line, we want ranchers to get paid. Bottom line, to me, that is the key driver in moving this forward, and I want them to be paid handsomely for their work, and not have that as another check the box you have to do. And so how that evolves, I still think, especially in the United States, is up in the air. We can consider one approach where we have measured ecosystem benefit. We have measured carbon or offsetting, and we can attach it to the calf. So whoever's buying said feeder calf knows that they're buying a calf with reduced emission, that they can now report to the packers they're working with, right? So it stays in the supply chain. Everybody knows that Ranch A that produced these feeder cattle did so in a way that lowered the emission footprinting. And therefore that inset is kept in the market. There's monetization to then offset those things. Other companies like Athion are wanting to peel that out and look at carbon more as an offset. And that's what's happening in a lot of global systems as well. It definitely doesn't, in my opinion, benefit the beef industry near as well if it goes from an inset to an offset, because now you've got Google and Meta and whoever, the big seven at play now on a carbon offset, right? And so that has its benefits from an economical perspective in terms of competition. It may not be as friendly to the people that need the product, and there's approaches that are happening that way as well. The key, and I think that what he talked about with how do you map it and how do you attach said benefit through the supply chain? Is it a Bitcoin approach, or is it as easy as an electronic ID that has the information on the tag when the calf leaves the ranch? That is all, I think, up in the air. Hell, I've read dissertations on the Bitcoin approach, and shit, it's above my pay grade, y'all. I can't understand that stuff to save my life. And so I tend to think a little more simplistically, like with an EID or other ways of doing it. But I'm sure there's some really smart folks out there that are going to figure it out.
Any follow-up thoughts there from Jeff or Paige? Jeff, you might want to answer this one from Nancy. Seems there's a big gap in the notion that if a producer has a grazing management plan or is doing regenerative practices, that they're actually making more money. Is there a movement that you are aware of on figuring out the economic benefits or not of grazing management planning?
We recently wrote a little report on the research around the socioeconomic benefits of grazing management plans, and there is data out there that suggests that there's certainly benefits, whether those be cultural, ecosystem, just benefits to the family unit, to well-being, economically. There's just not enough of it, right? There's not enough research out there at the end of the day, we can talk about all of the ecologic parameters, but there's human beings managing their ranch. And I don't think that we've spent enough time trying to discern those benefits. And so, we see anecdotally all of these ranches that are quote unquote doing better, right? If they're adopting many of these, term them regenerative, adaptive, whatever you want to call them. And they're seeing benefits at their ranch scale, right? Both economically, socially, and ecologically. But we need to do a better job of providing the research to substantiate that. I think many times, I think there's ranchers that are ahead of the science in many cases. And so, I don't think we don't have near enough of that research.
I might also add a couple of thoughts to Jeff's comments. I think he's wholly right, and there's I think two things I want to add. First, Nancy, that was a great question, and I think gets at the heart of the socioeconomic drivers and barriers to, you know, quote unquote, regenerative adaptive management practices. And I'll also add that it's a bit of a chicken and egg question, because there's research to suggest that, you know, ranchers who are on the regenerative spectrum may be more profitable, but there's also evidence to suggest that more profitable ranchers also have a greater propensity to adopt these practices. And so which comes first? I think, you know, we don't know, probably both are true at the same time. And I think the other point of that is that there are lots of ways at getting at improved profitability. So it's not just always improved productivity. It might not be doubling the amount of animals that you have on your given land base. It could also be something like improving your soil health, sequestering soil carbon so that you're able to minimize your off-farm inputs like hay purchases, for example. And so, you know, maybe you reduce your herd size, but you have to buy less hay. And so that equals out to greater profitability. I've seen that among ranchers that I've worked with. And so I think, you know, broadening the scope of what we consider improved productivity, profitability will help us answer that question. But also, you know, we've got a lot of work to do in understanding what drives what or what follows what in terms of social and ecological and economics here.
Thank you, Paige and Jeff. I just put a link to that report that Jeff and his team produced for us in the chat if anyone's interested. Oh, did that go? Nope, it didn't. Sorry. I will put it in the chat to everyone. My bad. We have one final question right now in the Q&A. Can you speak to the use of biochar as a catalyst in this space to manipulate CEC and increased TDN? Or CEC, sorry.
Take it, Paige.
Honestly, probably not. I'm not the best person to answer that question. There are certainly experts in the biochar space that would certainly be a better fit to answering that. Most of my expertise comes in terms of grazing management, but we know that biochar is an opportunity, but like all other, I think, soil carbon drawdown practices that require an input in grazing land situations tend to come with the scale and cost challenge. So that's why I think grazing is certainly the largest opportunity that we have on these landscapes. So for example, you know, we have all of this research, especially coming out of California, informing the use of compost on rangelands. We know that compost application can drive quite a large delta in soil carbon sequestration, but number one, it's expensive. So who's going to pay for it? Do we expect that to come out of the pockets of ranchers? I hope not. And second of all, where is all of that compost going? You know, we're talking about ranches that may span upwards of 400,000 acres in some cases. And so the scale of application of something like biochar or compost comes at a scale and a cost challenge. And that's where grazing management, I think, beats out both, even though the carbon potential might be lower and slower. But on the specifics and the mechanics of biochar and soil carbon, I think I'd have to pass the buck to somebody with more expertise in that.
Unless there are questions in the chat I missed, we have addressed all of the questions. Jeff, Jason, Paige, if there's maybe anyone you want to call upon to join in the discussion, or if there's more that we want to talk through here, look to you.
I'm tired.
I guess I would just say that if, you know, we've had a robust discussion, we've talked about a lot of things. If there's items or specifics that you think we've lost or missed, please send those to Sam or whomever needs to get them so that we can add those conversations to the list before we get to our meeting in October.
Yeah. So to kind of follow on that and maybe wrap it up here, unless any more burning questions come through, we will be sending out a post post focus group session recording and link to a survey. The survey is less about how did we do and more about what did we miss. So to Jeff's point, please let us know if there are items here that we are not thinking about currently that we should be thinking about. We're going to be leveraging these 3 sessions to really think through what are the key challenges and gaps and drivers that we need to have in mind as we fully build out this beef sustainability research roadmap. So now is truly the chance to get some feedback to us and make sure that your thoughts are considered as we're building this out as a beef community. On the screen right now, you've got that QR code to register for our following session. So as I mentioned, we're focusing in right now on land, air, and water to address those 3 more environmental goals that the Roundtable has. So we have some awesome experts that are going to be helping us lead those discussions in the coming weeks. And a lot of what will be discussed at those also tie in very heavily to this land piece that we've discussed today. So I'd really encourage everyone to join that if you're able to. We'll get that survey out to everyone shortly and really welcome any feedback. I'll also just put in my chat here for everyone my email address. So if you have follow-up thoughts, questions, anything, just please don't hesitate to reach out. I can always get you directed to the right person if the question's not for me specifically. But we really appreciate everyone's time here. We're really looking forward to the next 2 sessions and really bringing this workshop to life, bringing the roadmap to life, and hopefully moving forward with some pretty cool opportunities for research here in the next few months. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Yes, Paige, Jason, and Jeff for leading this discussion for us. Look forward to continuing this work and conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.